What's happening? Welcome to Everything Explained. I'm your host, Cory Wong. I'm here with one of the Electro-Voice engineers, mastermind extraordinaire, Ethan Wetzell. We're here to talk about phase. What is phase? Why should you care? And how can we prevent issues with phase? Now, in order to understand phase out of the gate, you have to understand very quickly that sound is basically just waveforms, right? Sound is waveforms, it's air pressure, and it comes and it hits our eardrums and it does a thing that we don't need to get into. Phase is basically where is the waveform in time related to other waveforms that are happening, okay? So oftentimes we'll have multiple sources of audio that are hitting your ear. Are they in phase or out of phase? Or sometimes we have one source of audio, like a drum set or a guitar, that's being picked up by multiple sources, and it might sound in or out of phase. Basically, when that sound gets to the microphone or your ear and how they interact with each other, right? So you often hear about this thing called phase cancellation, or something's out of phase, something's in phase. Kind of elusive, but we're here to talk a little bit about it and what it might sound like. The most common thing for me is sometimes if I'm listening to a recording of some drums that I just listened back to, I'll check the phase relationship between the overheads and the kick. Yeah. And sometimes it'll sound great. Other times I'll listen to a recording. It's like, why is there no low end? Why does it feel like the bottom is just empty? And I'll flip the phase on maybe one of the overheads, maybe the kick drum. And then all of a sudden, it opens up and all of a sudden it's full. I'll do the same thing. Sometimes I'm recording acoustic guitars with multiple microphones. It's like, I don't know. It just sounds like something's missing in the frequency. It doesn't sound like an accurate representation the way that it normally does. Flip the phase on something and all of a sudden, there it is. It's all of a sudden full. And then there's also in-betweens where it's kind of out of phase, which is where things get interesting. And then if I've engineered it and it's already done at this point or somebody else has, there's plugins to help this sort of thing. You know, there's like the auto alignment plugins, or there's a UAD Little Labs phase fixer sort of thing where you can like adjust the phase or whatever. But I want to dive into a little bit of the science of phase cancellation, how we can prevent any phase issues, and also just explain, I think if we have a good understanding of what phase is, it'll help us understand what issues we might run into and how to prevent them or fix them. Ethan, this is where I need you to take over because you have this fun little thing happening here, and you're the scientist when it comes to this. So let's go.
Yeah, so I think that was a great introduction, Cory. And, you know, when we talk about audio and we talk about sound, there are two fundamental things that we're working with that we as engineers need to understand and need to manipulate. The first is, of course, frequency. You know, equalization and EQs, those are going to be our tools for adjusting those. But the other one that's really important and oftentimes overlooked is time. And one of the interesting things about how that works is when we're talking about signals and audio sources, whether they're an instrument or my voice coming out of my mouth or a loudspeaker, we've got distance in between ourselves and the other sound sources that we're listening to, and all of those are interacting. Now, distance, because sound has a speed of time at which it travels, there's the speed of sound. Time and distance are really synonymous when we're talking about audio. So I've put together a bit of a software demonstration up here, and I want to explain a little bit about what's going on. In the first screen, I've created a view where I've got...
Can we just stop for a second and acknowledge my 9th grade math teacher, Mrs. Veets, and how just stoked she's going to be that we're talking about rate and time here, and we're going to get into some math here. For those of you at home also that were like, I'm not going to use this, here we go.
Here we go.
We got the math in action right now. Thank you. Thank you. Sorry for the interruption. Had to shout out Ms. Veets.
No, and
speaking of smelling like cigarettes, we were talking about... He was talking about taking a red eye from Las Vegas. I show up in class like, jeez.
Yeah.
Anyway,
if you never,
lovely old woman.
If you never thought you'd dig into sines and cosines again, well, I'm here to prove all of that completely wrong. So what I've put together here is a couple of different visualizations to kind of help visualize this. Now, when we look at sound, generally speaking, in a two-dimensional view, I can look at time or I can look at frequency.
Yeah.
And I've put together a visualization here. We're all the way over on the left side of the screen. We're looking at two sine waves. I've taken one, and what I'm doing is applying a bit of delay to it,
Yeah.
which in our practical terms here is essentially the same as me moving away from you. As I move closer to you, I'm shortening the amount of time that it takes my voice to reach your ears.
Yes.
I'm doing the same thing here.
Okay.
The second oscilloscope that I've got up there is showing these two sine waves interacting with each other and summing. So I'm mixing them together.
Yep.
And what we can see happening right here is actually perfect cancellation, because I am 180 degrees out of phase between my two sine waves. So if I look at the green line, you can see that those cancel perfectly. But as I begin to reduce that time and that offset to bring them more and more into phase with each other, you'll see that I'm getting that audibility coming back. And once I reach a distance that's half a wavelength or less in phase, or 90 degrees or less, now I begin to actually add together and sum, so I'm getting more and more and more signal.
Until now, they're perfectly in phase.
Now they're perfectly in phase at this frequency.
At this frequency.
And this is where things get really interesting and really complex in the world of phase, because we're talking not only about time and the relationship between two signals, but it's also very frequency dependent. And you can see what I mean if I begin to make this a more complex waveform, and I begin to add some partials and some harmonics here.
So we have some harmonics being added.
Yep.
Just changing the wave shape.
Exactly.
Like you would on a synthesizer.
Yeah, and you can hear that coming through. I've added more information and more sonics
saw
to it.
wave.
But now as I begin to adjust this timing relationship between the two, you can both see and hear those differences. And something
filtering.
you'll notice is exactly that.
So that's what I don't really understand. I'm glad we're doing this, because I hear about phase cancellation, comb filter. I know how to recognize it, because it's like, it sounds weird.
Yep.
It's called comb. Like I know chartreuse when I see chartreuse, but I
Exactly.
didn't always know like what was it called. It's like kind of teal. It's like no. No, it's like explain to me chartreuse here. Comb filtering.
Right. So
Does it apply to sine waves, or is it only when it's more complex and harmonics?
no, essentially, a sine wave is what's referred to as a pure tone.
Yes.
It is one frequency and only one frequency.
Yeah.
So you will have a very specific point where that frequency is in phase or out of phase.
I think the
with another
listeners might
sine wave.
want us, as we're explaining this, to turn it down a little.
Sure. We can absolutely
And
do
by
that.
the listeners, I mean me.
You don't.
I need to be able to focus on this.
You don't like
You're,
the
you're one of those
constant
people who
solid?
has you're engineering all day. It's like, yeah, you can tune this. It's like me with a metronome. I can just like tune it out. We can have a conversation for 45 minutes, and I won't even remember that yeah.
Right. Well, so the interesting thing about this, and I'll just go through a quick sweep of this so you
Yes.
can hear that swooshy sound that's very characteristic of the comb filter. Or, for some of you who are into guitar effects pedals, that may sound a little bit like a phaser.
Phaser. Yep.
Go figure.
So a phaser is really just doing comb filtering?
Well, what's interesting is a lot of the studio tools that we take for granted as effects are really just time adjustments. So a phaser, a chorus, a flanger, and actually even reverbs and delays are just adjustments of signals in time and how they interact with each other. It's all about creating that different relationship to get those filters. And that's fantastic when you're dialing in your studio tone or working on a track in production. It's not so great when you're applying it to the entire mix all the time, every time, because your speakers are in the wrong spot.
Yeah, sure.
So where this becomes really important is understanding that this relationship of addition and cancellation will vary by frequency, and it will also vary by space and time. So if we go to a more practical example where we talk about how these things can interact with each other in the real world in speaker placement, we can actually see where some of these things begin to create challenges and problems for you when you're setting up a PA.
Yes. Okay, so let's talk about, actually, I first have a question
Absolutely.
before we step into the real world. Comb filtering versus phase cancellation.
I'm getting this cancellation that's happening at very specific spots. So at this frequency, at this timing offset...
Oh, it's just going to deaden certain spots.
You can see I've got these notches.
Okay.
But what I can do here to sort of illustrate this is now I can change the frequency, and you'll see that those points of cancellation are also going to move.
Yes.
So this is dependent on both time or space or distance, as well as frequency. Those things are all going to interact with each other, so I will get these periodic nulls and these periodic summations.
Yes.
So I'm boosting some signals and I'm canceling others.
Okay, so the reason why we should care about phase and moving into real-world examples is if we have phase taken care of, we're not going to have dead spots in our sound. We're not going to have dead spots, things that feel unnatural. Now, that is both on the recording side and on the listener side. So
100%.
Let's start with the recording side. A very simple rule that we learn in school is the 3-to-1 rule. So if I have a microphone that's 1 inch away from my guitar cab, the second microphone should either be exactly in the same place or 3 inches away. Mm-hmm. So basically 3-to-1. Or if I have a microphone that's 5 feet away from the source, the next one should be 15 feet away from the source. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, that can't always be the case. If you just look at miking a drum set, we typically have 12 mics or something on a kit. Mm-hmm. And of course, when we're playing live or if we're just recording in a room together, there's going to be a vocal mic just kind of where it makes sense for the vocalist to be and where the bass cab should be. It's not always, we don't have rulers out for everything, right? So sometimes you just deal with what you're dealing with. And in that case, the thing that we do to try to solve that is, well, let's make sure we're using the right microphones. Mm-hmm. On a drum set, you're not going to use a Neumann U87 on Tom 2 because it's just going to catch too much other stuff. It doesn't make any sense. We put a clip-on dynamic mic, super cardioid, a vocalist, you have as tight of a polar pattern as possible. So it's as much isolation as we can get.
Yep.
And the placement of these things, we try to solve so there's as few issues as possible. And of course, like I said, sometimes in post, we'll use different plugins or alignment things to try to, if it really looks like it's bad. But when you're actually recording the source, you're going to want to check these things out. And you can actually even see, for those of you that record in your own DAW at home, put a few mics up and zoom in to where the waveforms are, and you'll be able to see at different distances the exact same thing you record. It's at different things. And also, for those of you that are using samples. Like when I pull up a kick drum sample from Splice and I want to layer it, or a snare sample, I'll sometimes be like, I added 2 other samples and it sounds smaller. The reason is sometimes those things end up being out of phase. So I'll shift things by just a couple milliseconds.
Yep.
And all of a sudden, gives me that huge thing I'm looking for. And, everybody records their samples and they're placed in different places. So you just have to make sure phase-wise that they're lined up.
Yeah, and it doesn't take much. Like you say, just a small couple of millisecond or microsecond adjustments can make all the difference in the world. And I guess a couple of other things to always bear in mind with this is, as you were saying, when you set up a recording environment like that, you're never going to be in a perfect situation. Yeah. So you've always got to just try to optimize for what you've got, especially on a stage. You've got a fixed amount of time. You got to get it dialed in. You got to make it work. So understanding the tools that you've got at your disposal, maybe this time we're going to use a hypercardioid instead of a cardioid mic because that's where people are relative to each other. Yeah. That's important. The other thing that I think is really critical for everybody to understand is things like phase cancellations are physical and acoustic phenomenons. I cannot fix an acoustic problem with an EQ. If I'm seeing one of these notches or dips due to phase cancellation, I cannot EQ my way out of that. Yeah. The only thing I could do is change my position or change my timing to try to get better alignment. Yeah. It's just the way physics work.
Yeah. Yeah, if there's no 100 hertz coming into the microphone, you're not just going to be magically able to get it happen.
Yeah, I mean, and you will actually most times get yourself into a situation that you're creating other problems.
Yes, exactly. So now another interesting time that we hear this or see this is occasionally when we're in venues or theaters or whatever, where you're going to see a band and it just sounds different in different parts of the room. Naturally, even in a very well-tuned room, a very well-tuned PA, it's just going to sound different because where the subwoofers and the speakers, the other speakers, the time it takes for those sound waves to hit you, it's going to react different if you're 100 feet away from the stage, if you're to the side, if you are right up in front of the stage. And often we'll find weird acoustic anomalies that I want to show why or when you might see those things.
Yeah.
So if you can pull up for us, there's a software that we use here at EV. It's a software where you can simulate acoustic environments and what certain speakers are going to do in those environments and what frequencies will respond in what way in those environments. So because we care enough in the things that we do, I know I care enough on my gigs. I want to tune the PA. I want to tune the room as best as possible. So that way, I mean, I've had this so many times where I'm at a gig and it's like, I feel no low end.
Yeah.
There's just like nothing here. Why is that? And then I'll walk 3 feet to the right or left. It's like, oh, this sounds great. Or somebody might say, oh my gosh, it was just so much low end. I felt like I was dying from the kick drum the whole gig, blah, blah, blah. Some of it's just proximity to where you are. Other things is where are the subs and the speakers placed and where are you in proximity to them?
And how do they interact with each other? Yeah.
Yes. So Ethan, tell me a little bit about what's going on here. What are we looking for? What are we looking at? And we'll kind of explain to those watching what kind of radar is happening here.
Absolutely. So what we're looking at here is, as you say, it's an acoustic modeling program. And this is something that is free to use. Anybody can get their hands on this. If you want to play around with speaker placement, it's something that we use for our concert sound systems. Yeah. What I've done in our model here is take two of our double 18 touring class subs, and I've placed them right next to each other. So these are what we would refer to as tight-packed subwoofers.
Yep.
And what you can see...
So for those right here, these two here are the subwoofers.
Yep.
All right.
And what you can see going on here is some of this constructive interaction between those two devices, where I'm starting to see this horizontal pattern collapse. I'm looking at this from the top down. And what we're seeing is this horizontal balloon is beginning to suck in, and I've got very even coverage going across my entire audience area. That's what you want.
To explain what that is, though. So right now, what we're looking at is how a room responds at 80 hertz, which is around where the kick drum is. Okay, so this is right there. And as we go out, these different colors represent a 6 dB change in the way that we feel or hear those frequencies.
Yeah, and I can even turn on the polar display here to make that even more obvious. So
this looks like a pretty good, it looks symmetrical. We got this avocado shape of, wherever you're at, it's fairly symmetrical.
Yep.
It's about what you would expect. Now, let's put these things in a position where it's not ideal for many listeners. Let's put them, what would be terrible, 20 feet apart in this room?
Well, funny thing about 20 feet and 80 hertz wavelength, that just so happens to do some really destructive stuff.
Yes.
So because of how these are going to interact, if I move this spacing to 20 feet between the two loudspeakers and I update this prediction, now we see all sorts of weirdness going on. And this is taking that comb filtering example to the extreme.
So now we've gone from the avocado shape to a Rorschach test, and things are just looking, I guess, to be fair, they are still symmetrical. But now all of a sudden, the way that the 6 dB differences are way different throughout the room. And we're also seeing several nulls, as in just like nothing in 80 hertz, pretty close to the stage. So if you look here, right here in this black zone, you're not getting any of this kick drum anymore. Yeah. And you move all of a sudden 4 feet to the right, you're getting blasted with the kick drum. So it's not very predictable once these speakers are in a placement that just is not optimized for sound. So
Yeah.
tell me what's going on here.
So what we see happening, and I turned on a couple of other things. So the grid each one of these grids is a 5-foot separation. So we
Yeah.
can see what's going on here. And if you look into my screen, you can see that as I move my mouse over, this is going to tell me exactly what the SPL is at that location.
Yeah.
And we'll talk more about SPL and decibels and how that works in another conversation.
Yep.
But I can see a big difference where here I'm at 109, and if I move 7 feet to my left, I'm at 119.
Yeah.
That's double the volume that I'm perceiving
Perceived, yes.
7 feet from left to right. So as you move around this venue, you're not just seeing Rorschach tests, you're going to feel like you're losing your mind because
Yes.
every time I move from side to side, the sound is going to be completely different.
Yeah.
So anybody who's ever experienced the power alley, as we call them, or the nulls for the subwoofer, this is what's going on. And as you get higher and higher and higher in frequency, when I'm dealing with high-end boxes, two-way systems, the exact same thing happens.
Yeah.
And like I say, that phaser effect is pretty cool on your guitar. It's not so awesome on the entire mix.
Yeah.
So the way that we can address this, again, is through spacing. I can't EQ my way out of these nulls.
Yeah.
So what I want to be able to do is get those loudspeakers together so I've got that summation. And again, now this is going to come back to very even coverage. I'm keeping that energy off the walls. I'm keeping it right on the audience where I want it to be.
Yeah.
And as people move side to side, front to back, I've got that even, consistent, clear coverage.
Yeah.
You're going to have a very happy audience, and everybody's going to love you.
Yeah. Which is also why when we set up our studios at home or an actual studio, where you place your speakers
Yep.
and where you place your subwoofer, those things matter. Those are going to change the way that your frequency response is perceived for where your sitting location, where your mix location is. Or maybe you step back 20 feet and all of a sudden it sounds way different. Mm-hmm. And a perfect example of when this is sometimes right or wrong. I mean, actually, this is objective. I don't even have to put the quotes up. It is a right or wrong thing. Sometimes it's just, are
Physics
you hearing?
are physics.
Yeah. We've gotten into some other subjective math with other engineers here at EV, which is a very fun topic to discuss. But these are objective things that, it's nice to have some things in music that are objective.
Absolutely. And, as you say, in the recording environment, where you place your speakers, factoring in those first and late reflections, how are those going to interact with your listening and your near-field environment? All of this is important. So, as I say, time is really the unsung tool that we as audio engineers have at our disposal, and it's one of the most important things to really get your head around if you're going to get the results that you want.
Sometimes you're at a festival and they have some sort or a venue and they just, there's a sponsor that came in and they, whatever, we got to put their sign right in the middle.
Yep.
Your subs can't be right next to each other. What do you do when you can't have it in the ideal placement? How do you help solve some of that?
Right. Well, in most DSP systems, certainly in our loudspeakers, you've got a delay parameter that you can adjust.
Yeah.
What that's going to do is, again, time and space from what we're talking about here is exactly the same thing. So I can use that delay to steer and align these things. Now, if I'm dealing with a major null or a major power alley, like I was showing in that 20-foot separation, I can't make that go away, but what I can do is I can steer it. So if I want to aim a null maybe onto the aisle that's going right down the center of the venue where people aren't, I can take advantage of that, steer the power towards where the people are, and use those dead spaces in the venue to soak up the null.
So really you just use it, you just go on the software and you're just like, delay this one by half a millisecond?
Absolutely. Well, and again, speed of sound. We can do that calculation pretty easily in our heads to figure out how exactly that's going to work.
Yeah.
Some of the DSPs will even allow you to move these in distance instead of time, just to keep it easier for you to be able to do that steering.
Yeah.
And one thing that's I would encourage everybody to do, as I say, this preview software that we use is free of charge. download it and play around with
Sure.
how these things interact with each other. So the next time you get to a venue, you know what to expect and you can
You
have
know
some
where to
contingency
sit.
plans. You know where to sit too.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, the delay thing I see all the time at festivals when it's just
Yep.
a huge festival stages and they have a line array right at the stage,
Yep.
and then they have one several hundred feet back. They're not just pumping out the exact same thing from the same source. It is time delayed
Yep.
because otherwise you get all this weird stuff happening. And actually, speaking of Vegas, a place that has so many speakers happening in the space is at Sphere. I was told it's Sphere, not the Sphere. It's
Singular.
like Eagles. I like to listen. It's my favorite Eagles song. It's not the Eagles.
Or Talking Heads.
Yeah, it's not the Talking Heads. It's
Yep.
Talking Heads. Okay, so it's at Sphere. There's a lot of speakers, and I don't know, 20,000 people. They have speakers all around, or whatever. That's got to be a pretty fun math problem to solve.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I mean, this is where we can really, really do some interesting things with not only spatial positioning, but time alignment.
Yeah.
And, there are other things that you can use time adjustment for. If we're dealing with a theater venue where I've got under balcony speakers to do those time delays, I can add just a little bit of an offset to achieve something called a Haas effect, which actually steers my localization down. So instead of my brain thinking I'm hearing the speaker that's right above me, by using a timing offset, I can actually fool the listener's brains into thinking that they're listening to something coming dead ahead.
That's pretty cool.
Instead of right above them. We can also use various tools, including delays, in things like complex subarrays, like some of the ETX models that we make, to create cardioid subwoofer patterns. So I can generate those nulls, but keep the sound off of the stage,
Yeah.
and again push that energy where I want it to go. So time is a really, really important tool as it works with distance, positioning, delay, shaping my sound, and getting those results for the audience that we need to get.
See, I've been just telling music students time's the deal, but now the engineers got to know too.
Time's all you got.
I got one last question before we leave. Phase versus polarity. These are things that I hear people use interchangeably, but I know that they're wrong. What's the difference?
Well, sometimes they're wrong, sometimes they aren't. So what polarity is going to do is basically just flip my positive and my negative voltages. So
In a cable.
In a cable, exactly. However, what that achieves is a 180-degree flip in phase.
Yeah.
So it's not wrong to say that by engaging or flipping the polarity, I'm flipping the phase. It's sort of like the whole square is a rectangle, but a rectangle isn't a square thing.
Got it.
I
Okay.
can use polarity to adjust my phase, but phase is a much more complex and nuanced thing than just flipping my polarity, because I may get into, I've got 360 degrees that I can move through, right?
Yeah.
Polarity is on or off. It's binary.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us. We got a whole series of everything explained. We're going through all kinds of audio things, music things, stuff that I'm curious about, stuff that we got the engineers to help explain. So thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time. Peace.